Hello and welcome to the unofficial BMB After Effects crash course for beginners. I'm Liam Osborne and I do a lot of the motion graphics work for BMB, which involves After Effects, and you'll see it in sports or shows or whatever. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to show you is just the layout of the software, that to a lot of people, understandably, looks very complicated, but really isn't, especially if you're familiar with Premiere Pro. So I'm going to start at the bottom here, where we have the timeline. The timeline, you can scrub back and forth like this. Right now, we don't have anything happening, but we'll make that change in the future. Here, we have the zoom in for the timeline, so you can get into more details, and you can also zoom out here. This bar at the top does the same thing. Then over here, you have the layers. You can see that this layer is the star, this layer is the rectangle, and the order of the layers changes the order in which things appear on the screen. So the top layer appears on top of everything else. If we come over here, we have the project panel. The project panel is where all of the files for our project are stored. Right now, the only thing I have here is this composition I'm working in. A composition is just your working space for an After Effects project. And I haven't imported any videos or images or anything like that, but if I did, this would be where I'd do it. There's also the Effect Controls panel, but I'll skip that for now because it's more relevant later on. In the center here, we have the Composition panel. The Composition panel is very simple. It just shows you a visual output of what you're working on. At the bottom of the Composition panel, you have some controls. This one zooms in and out, so you can select maybe 100%, that's too far zoomed in for me. 50% is a little, 50% is about right for me. But there's also the fit option, which will automatically scale it to fill however much space is available. Then next to that you have the display resolution, which is either full resolution, half, third, or quarter. There's also an auto option, and the only reason you would ever change this from full to something else is if you're having performance issues. If things are running slowly, then running it at a lower resolution, like quarter, can sometimes help. But right now, I'm not having any trouble, so I'm going to keep it at full. Then you have this button here, which toggles the transparency grid in the background, which can be very useful. Sometimes you want to see it like you're going to see it when it exports, but sometimes you do want to see that transparency grid. It can be very useful. So this button toggles it on and off. Next, I'll come over to the right side of the screen, where there are a lot of panels here, most of which are not very useful. We'll start with the character and the paragraph panels. These panels are very useful for editing text. So I'll create a text layer just for demonstration. I'll make it say Chihuahua. Now, if I select this text layer, I can come under Character, and I can change the font to whatever I like. I'll make it this. I can change the color, and the font size, and other properties of the text as well. Right below it, in the paragraph panel, you can change the text alignment to left. Well, you have to select the text first. To left, center, or right. Gives you some other options here, but those aren't very important. Next, we have the Align panel. Now, this is actually one of the most useful panels. It allows you to automatically, perfectly line up a layer with, say, the center, or the left, or the bottom, or the right. Completely automatically does it for you, so you don't have to do math and figure out where it needs to go. Very, very useful. And then we have the Effects and Presets panel, which is where all of the effects are stored. These effects are things that you can apply to layers to change their behavior or how they look. For example, I'll search for the fill effect, and I can drag it onto, let's say, the rectangle. Right now it does nothing, but if we come up to the Effect Controls panel, we can see that the fill effect has a bunch of different controls that we can change. So for this effect, the main one is color, because what the fill effect does is it just changes the entire layer to be a single color. So maybe I'll make it a dark green, like that. Lastly, if we come up to the top of the screen, we can see that there are some tool icons here. Most of them are not very important, but a few of them can be very useful. First, the selection tool, which you can activate by pressing V on the keyboard, allows you to, well, do exactly what it sounds like. Select things, move them around. You can do it in the composition panel too. You can click things, drag them around. It works exactly like you would expect a mouse to regularly. Next to that, we have the hand tool, which sort of works in the exact opposite way. It, instead of moving things around, moves you around relative to other things. If I zoom this in, I can show you it works on the timeline too. Next, there's the shape tool, which if you click on and hold, gives you several different options for different shapes. I'll select the star tool, and over here you can change the color of the star. I'll make it maybe like a dark yellowish orange color. And then we'll make a star by clicking and dragging to change the size. Next, there's the pen tool, which works very similarly to the shape tool, but instead of defined shapes, you can create custom shapes by clicking and creating points. Now, you can create more refined shapes by, when you click to create a point, click and drag to make a rounded curve. And then click the end to close the shape. Lastly, there's the text tool. You can click anywhere on the screen and start typing. Of course, that's off the screen, but you get the idea. I can drag it down here. Lovely. So now that you've all seen an overview of how the layout works, let's create a new project. I'll go up to File, New, and New Project. Unfortunately, I won't be saving the changes to this masterpiece here. And now we have a blank slate to work with. Almost always the first thing that you want to do when you create a new project is create a new composition. There are a few different ways you can do this. First, there's a very obvious New Composition button right here. Also, you can go to Composition, New Composition up in the top menu. Lastly, you can go to the Project panel, right-click in the empty space, and select New Composition. All of these options will bring you to the same menu here, where you can give the composition a name, and you can change other properties of the composition. You'll pretty much always want the width and height to be 1920 by 1080, so we'll leave that alone. You'll pretty much always want to make sure that this is set to square pixels. I like to work in 60 frames per second, so I'll leave it like that. The rest should be fine. Click OK. And now we have a blank canvas to work with. Now, oftentimes the next thing you'll want to do when you're creating a new project is import some images or videos to work with. There are a few different ways you can do this. You can come to the project panel, right-click, import, file. This will bring you up to the file menu. Or you can go to File, Import, and this gives you the same menu where you can select File, and then it brings you to the File Explorer. Lastly, you can just select some files in a window here and drag them right in. Now, I've already prepared two images of Captain America's shield and this cat. You can preview both of these individually by double-clicking on them, which brings them up in the Footage panel. Now let's switch back to the Composition panel, where we can see our really cool composition that we've created. I'm going to select both of the images, and I'm going to drag them in. And now we have them both in the composition. If you want to change the order of the layers at all, you can drag them around on top of each other. Now I'm going to start arranging the elements in the frame. I'm going to first start with the image of the shield. If I open up this arrow here, it shows me this transform drop-down. The transform properties here allow me to change how the layer looks and where it's positioned. Let's start with the position. Position has two number values, which are just an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate. So you can drag them around like this. It's fairly straightforward. You can also, of course, reposition by clicking and dragging on here, though that's a lot less precise. So I'm going to drag the shield over here, and I think that's where I want it. Next, I want to make the shield smaller. So I'll come under Scale, and I can select either one of these numbers, they're linked together, and drag it and make the scale smaller. Now I'm going to move it over a little bit more. Next, we have opacity. This changes the transparency of the layer. So 0% is completely invisible, 100% is completely solid. Next, we have rotation, which is two numbers. The first number is the number of complete rotations that you want it to make. That's more useful later on. Right now we'll stick with the second number, which is just in degrees how much rotation you want. So I'm going to put it about there. Lastly, we have anchor point. The anchor point is this point here. It's the point around which the image rotates and scales. Now, that can be a little hard to understand without a proper demonstration. Let's bring up the scale. We can see that it's getting bigger and smaller around this point. But if I move the anchor point, we can see that now the anchor point is all the way over here. I can adjust the position to compensate, so now it's in the same place, but the anchor point is all the way over here. So now if I scale it, it'll scale from that point. Same thing with rotation. If I change the rotation now, it'll rotate around the anchor point here. Now, for what I'm doing right now, this isn't very useful. But for some complex animations, it can be very, very important to understand that. Right now, I'm going to reset the anchor point by right-clicking on it and selecting Reset. I'm now going to reposition it to where I want it and scale it back down. Now let's work on our cat here. I'm going to open up Transform Properties, and I'll position the cat over here, and I'll scale it up, and I'll give it some rotation. So now we have our cat and we have our shield exactly where we want them, but it's not moving. So in order to make things move, we have to do something called keyframing. If we go back under the Transform Properties, you can see that they all have a stopwatch icon next to them. What this does is it allows you to change any of these values over time. So I'm going to start by moving the playhead to the beginning of the clip and positioning the shield where I want it. I actually want the shield on top, so I'm going to rearrange the layers. Now I'm going to click the stopwatch icon. This is going to create a keyframe right here on this frame. You'll notice if I move the playhead around, the keyframe stays exactly where it is. This keyframe stores the information for where the shield is on that frame, and you can move it around by dragging. But still nothing's happening. That's because we need to create another keyframe. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to skip to 1 second in. You can see the time code over here. I'm going to reposition the shield. You can see that now, because I have keyframes enabled with the stopwatch, it automatically creates another keyframe whenever I change the position. That means if I go back to the beginning and play by hitting spacebar, that now the shield moves from the beginning of the clip to a second in. You can change the timing of this by moving the keyframe around. So if I want the animation to happen slower, maybe I'll move the keyframe to 3 seconds, and now the shield moves really slowly. Or if I want it to happen faster, I can skip to about half a second and move the keyframe there. Now the shield moves really quickly. I'm going to put it back to where it was originally though. Next, I want the shield to rotate when the cat throws it. So I'll enable keyframes for the rotation, and I'll skip to the end of the animation, and I'll change the rotation value. Now this first number here tells you how many complete rotations the shield will make. So maybe I want it to rotate 5 times. Let's see what that looks like. You can see that the shield rotates really quickly. But now what if I want to make the rotation slower? I can go back to the keyframe here, and you can skip back and forth by individual frames by holding Control and pressing the left and right arrows. You'll know you're over a keyframe when this button over here is blue. So right now I'm not over a keyframe. Right now I am. Now if I change this 5 to a 2, it'll complete only 2 rotations instead of 5. Now the shield is rotating much more slowly. But now I also want the shield to get smaller as it moves away. So I'll move to the beginning, enable keyframes for scale, and now skip to the end of the animation, make sure I'm on exactly the right frame, and I'll make the shield smaller. So now, if I skip to the beginning and hit play, we can see that our shield moves, rotates, and gets smaller. This is the foundation of basic animation, and there's a lot you can do with just this. You can apply these concepts to a lot of really advanced animations, and we'll talk more about how to apply those in later chapters. But for now, this has been the first chapter of the crash course, and I'll be back soon with chapter 2. I'm Liam Osborne.